supposed to tell us that they were. And then when those drugs were released into the human population, it turned out they were not safe and people died. Now the problem is, I was absolutely unable to alert the world to this problem for reasons that still elude me. I published my paper. I went through, I don't think we need to bore your audience, especially if they've been through Eric's description, with the details of what happened in the attempt to bring this to public attention. But the world of scientists working on the question was unwilling to respond to the discovery that their model organism had this fatal flaw that was going to predispose us to see certain things and not other things in the laboratory environment. The governmental commission that was charged with studying the Vioxx scandal, which I believe was likely the result of something like this, in its 300-page report doesn't mention mice. It doesn't.
The Vioxx scandal, which was a drug for arthritis, correct?
Yeah.
It gave people strokes.
Yeah, it did heart damage.
Yeah.
And so anyway, heart damage is actually probably not heart damage. And by that what I mean is if you take a drug, a substance that damages tissues in the human body, it will show up as heart damage because of the special nature of the heart. So let's say that you took some drug that, killed every 10,000th cell or every 1,000th cell. That would be destructive all over your body. The heart, though, is a special tissue. The heart has a very low capacity for self-repair at a cellular level, very low, for reasons we could go into if you wanted. But because it has a low capacity for self-repair, it is also very vulnerable to something that does some kind of general tissue damage. And it's also an organ that when it fails, it's absolutely conspicuous. So you would expect that if we had substances that were body-wide toxins and we released them into the public, having tested them on mice and not discovering that they were dangerous, that you would see relatively young people die from heart conditions, which is where we would detect that there's a problem before we would detect it anywhere else. So anyway, the government studied this problem after Vioxx, and it put together a report. And the report's 300 pages. It doesn't mention mice. It doesn't mention the genus Mus.
Do you think they did that to protect themselves?
Well, what I know is that I attempted to call their attention. After the report came out, I looked at it, and, it had a physical form, but it also it lives online. You can search it. And I could see that telomeres weren't mentioned, mice weren't mentioned, rodents aren't mentioned. And so I tried to alert them to the fact that they had screwed up, and they blew me off. They wouldn't talk to me. So it raises a question, and I, to this day, cannot answer the question. I can't even say whether or not. So when I've tried to raise this issue, I have run into various kinds of resistance. If I raise it with journalists, what I get back is typically I get interest back at first. And they say, okay, I'm very interested in the story. I'm going to pursue it. I'm going to make a few phone calls. And then they come back to me and they go silent, or they say, well, I talked to some people and they said, it's been taken care of, right? Well, I don't know what it's been taken care of means. I published a paper that said, here's a hypothesis about what's going on. Here's I proposed a mechanism whereby telomere elongation would have happened in the breeding colonies in question. And
it's been taken care of is a very strange way to describe something that could be an enormous problem.
Well, not only, let's say that it was taken care of, right? Let's say that they have altered the breeding protocol and they've fixed the problem.
You still have all those drug tests that they've done for...
You've got all those drug tests. You've got all of the papers. You've got my paper, which proposes a hypothesis, and I have a right to say, actually, it turns out to be correct, or it wasn't, right? But so anyway, we got back all of these weird answers. It's been taken care of, or even more curious is the argument, well, everybody knows that the mice are bad models, which is insane because this telomere
You actually got that response?
Yeah.
From?
Several people. I went to several different journalists, and it wasn't that I was told who they contacted. What I was told was that they contacted somebody, and this is what they heard. And so their enthusiasm evaporated at the point they make a phone call. So
were they not aware of the consequences of this problem with these mice?
So, again, this is a serious problem. It's not about mice. It's not about virology, right? It's a general systemic failure of reason. So what I encountered as a young, somewhat naive graduate student was an instance which frankly woke me up to the fact that my colleagues, even when human life was on the line, were going to pretend they didn't know what was going on. It's quite possible they didn't know until I had put out my hypothesis, and Carol Greider, who later pretended she didn't know what I was talking about, published the empirical work that revealed that indeed lab mice are unusual in having long telomeres. After that work was out, there's no excuse for not investigating what the consequences were. I cannot explain it except to say that the culture of science has become so rotten that this sort of thing is maybe standard operating procedure.
Just protecting their ass and protecting the ass of those who give them jobs and all the work that's been done that sort of establishes that they should be doing these tests in the first place.
I'm sure they tell themselves some story in which they are the heroes and they are protecting us from something. But I look at my own medicine cabinet, and even though I am aware of what likely happened, I am in no position to protect myself or my family. The only way to be protected from the downstream consequences of this error is to just not take pharmaceuticals.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it's a really huge problem, and the response of the system generally to shut down the lone individual trying to point out a serious problem is just breathtaking. And when you've seen it, when you've lived it, you never go back. You know, you've looked into the eye of something that is willing to ignore. It's willing to ignore not only human life, but it is willing to ignore the requirements of good science. How could you leave an error like that undescribed?
And how is this being discussed on a fucking comedian's podcast? Why is this not front page of the New York Times? Why is this not leading on the news when you're talking about the safety of pharmaceutical drugs? How is this not something that's an enormous story?
Well, this raises another question, something I actually wanted to set the record straight about. By and large, I thought Eric did a fantastic job of describing this. In fact, we're here at the tail end of this podcast, and we're both tired, and I feel like I've done a much worse job than he did describing the science. But I wanted to correct one thing, and I think it will help answer the question you just asked me. You asked Eric why I had not pursued this, and you said maybe was he afraid? And Eric indicated that was some part of it. It's no part of it, and I think Eric has actually forgotten what happened. So I was dogged about this for a decade. I tried everything I could think of. I talked to every journalist who would listen. As I said, I went to the Committee on Drug Safety, the Blue Ribbon Commission. I did everything I could think of. I wrote when Carol Greider, who refused to acknowledge my contribution, got her Nobel Prize, I wrote what I think was a generous op-ed to the New York Times saying that her Nobel Prize was deserved, but that we had this serious problem related to mouse telomeres, and that maybe now this Nobel Prize would give us the courage to look at it. They wouldn't publish it. So I tried everything I could think of. And at one point, a good friend of ours, a guy named Mike Brown, he was the former CFO of Microsoft, really good guy, made a ton of money because he was at Microsoft on the ground floor, and he used to hold something he called Science Camp. And Science Camp involved gathering a bunch of really high-quality people to talk privately where nobody was aware that we were even gathered, right? It really gave us the room to be frank. And I was there, and I gave a talk on telomeres. I gave a talk about the science, and I talked about the politics that I had run into. And, they were blown away. It was, it's jaw-dropping stuff. And afterwards, Eric and Mike took me aside, and they said, we understand why this is having the effect on you that it's having, but you're wrapped around the axle. That was their phrase. You're wrapped around the axle about the story. It's preventing you from doing what you need to do. And I didn't like hearing that. And initially I thought, no, that's not right. And then I think they were right. And so I let it go. And I only talked about it with my students from that point forward. I tried to teach the science as clearly as I could and tried to keep the politics as far away from it as I could. And it's very hard to do. But I let it go. Now, at that point, I was a obscure college professor at an obscure college. I had 400 Twitter followers. I wasn't in a position to push the case if somebody didn't want to hear it. Eric is right that we are in a different era. I have 300,000 Twitter followers, 130,000 YouTube subscribers. I got powerful friends. It is possible that that is enough to get this raised at the level that it would need to be raised in order to get it addressed. But I'm not convinced of that. My experience trying to get the topic addressed anywhere for more than a decade was that it was like having a big hammer and there's a bell and you keep running at the bell and slamming it with the hammer and there's no sound. It does not ring. There's nothing that you can do to make it ring. Now, maybe at this higher profile, there is now enough firepower to get that bell to ring. But Eric's podcast, which is probably among the best places if you want to know the scientific story to go to, you can listen to his The Portal number 19, and you can hear him. He catches me off guard. He forces me to tell this story, which I didn't. I should have seen it coming, but I didn't. So anyway, you get the raw version. It is possible that we are now going to get the bell to ring, but episode 19 of The Portal did not cause it to ring. It caused a flurry of activity outside of mainstream scientific circles, but it did not cause anybody to sit up and take notice inside. And that is the thing I think we still don't know. We don't know what force we're up against. The pharmaceutical industry has mice that will tell us that drugs that they are advancing into the market are safe when they are not. And maybe that's the force that prevents the bell from ringing. I really have no idea. But I guess the question is the era different because we're at a higher profile, or isn't it?
It seems like we would need more than just the scientific community. We would need someone else in media to press the scientific community and say, what's going on here? To press the pharmaceutical industry and say, address this. Is this an issue or is this not an issue? Is he correct? If he is correct, what do we do about this? And what does this mean?
What do we do about this, and how many other thises are they? I happened on this completely by accident. I happened on this because I was a generalist who was interested in interesting things, and I was interested in evolution, and this just happened to show up. And so, I pursued it. There were features of my character that caused me to pursue it when others would have let it go. But it still indicates that there may be many such things lurking that we have no awareness of, and that the fact that systems are so good at shutting down a story like this means that it would be very unlikely that you would have heard that there was a flaw like this. So I don't know the answer